Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. I appreciate everyone making time to come to Annapolis and have our final little conversation for the calendar year. I think there have been questions around the internet, and there is a sign in as guest, and then MDGA should get you in. I think it has been suffering a little bit, so please be patient. It's, we've all enjoyed that. So thank you again to everyone for all the hard work during the interim. It's been a whirlwind of activity, and I appreciate that very much. On the agenda today, we have a discussion of our 2023 recommendations and a discussion of topics for the next interim in 24. Before we jump into that, I did want to give the secretary the opportunity to share some thoughts, and after that, we will get to business. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to give an update on obviously the capital budget as we just presented last week. As you know, when we started this commission several months ago, we talked about the hole in the capital program. It's driven by some major factors. Clearly, the increase in costs on the capital side and our operating costs far exceed the revenue growth. And as you know, we've been kicking around the issue of the impact of electric vehicles and the increase in mileage of vehicles and what that does for the motor fuel tax. We've been talking about that a bit. Also associated, obviously, with COVID was the loss of revenue from the fare box. But the big one is the loss of COVID dollars, where we've been supporting transit both in Washington and Baltimore in the tune of almost $3 billion over the last 4 years to support operating costs. All those things have come basically to a head. And then under state law, we have to produce a balanced budget. So that's what we've done. Obviously, the process then goes forward starting in January. So I'm sure there'll be lots more discussions on some of the options there going forward. I also want to mention on light rail, because that's another thing that obviously has played out, and Holly's been doing a fantastic job on getting on top of that. It has nothing to do with a fiscal issue. That's a warranty issue. So we'll work with our vendor there to get that straight and get that service out there as quickly as possible. But it does reinforce our number one goal, which we talk about all the time and we're committed to, which is safety. And if we find something that puts people in danger, we're not going to operate it. So with that, I know it's been in the news. I'm sure everyone in this commission has been reading about it. So I just want to make sure everyone was on the same page.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. Before we get into a discussion of the recommendations, I wanted to flag for all of you the letters on your desk. They've been posted online that we will follow, the interim report to the governor and the presiding officer. As I explained in my cover letter during our deliberations, this interim, the commission faced an unexpected challenge with the release of MDOT CTP in September, revealing a funding shortfall exceeding $2 billion over the next 6 years. This shortfall, coupled with an unprecedented nature of the situation, prompted the commission to divert its immediate attention to policy updates and discussions on new transportation and revenue fee options. I think it's important to emphasize that our primary focus remains on the broader aspect of transportation policy and funding on statewide scale, and that the commission's recommendations represent insights for the General Assembly's consideration in the 2024 legislative session. I just want to emphasize that the work of this commission should not be construed as preempting the essential work of the administration, the General Assembly, and MDOT in minimizing the impact of the proposed cuts in the recent draft CTP. That being said, I'd like to move forward with finalizing our interim recommendations as a commission. On your desk, you have the revised copy of the recommendations I'm putting forward today, taking into account commissioners' input along with public input. I would like to have the staff go through describing all the recommendations, and then after any discussion, I would like to move the recommendations as a full package for a vote. After discussion of our recommendations, I'd like to have staff discuss what items in the commission's charge are outstanding, to get any feedback from commissioners on specific things you would like us to cover next interim. Staff is going to be taking notes and will include that information in the appendix of our report. If there are no questions or comments before we start, I will turn this over to Michelle Lambert from DLS to discuss my interim recommendations. Is that suitable to everyone? Okay, great. Thank you. Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been asked to go through the 3 sections of the report, highlighting some of the background information and what the specific recommendations you are voting on. So I will go through that now. Section 1, at the first meeting, the Maryland Commission on Transportation Revenue and Infrastructure Needs heard from DLS about the sources and uses of the trust fund. Motor fuel taxes make up the largest share of funding from the trust fund. The motor fuel tax has served as the primary source of funding for transportation projects in the United States for almost 100 years because it was an efficient proxy for a direct user fee. However, at its first meeting, the commission heard from a transportation consultant that because of fuel efficiency and the dramatic shift towards EVs, Maryland may have reached its peak of revenue from motor vehicle fuel tax. This trend in Maryland is similar to motor fuel sales statistics in other states like Virginia, New York, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. At its first meeting, the commission also heard about the nationwide trends in EV sales for both battery EVs and plug-in hybrid EVs. Between 2017 and 2020, new EV sales in the United States averaged 300,000 per year. In Maryland, EV registrations have increased from less than 10,000 vehicles in 2016 to almost 70,000 vehicles in 2022. At its 4th meeting, the commission had a discussion related to collecting an additional fee on EVs and hybrid vehicles to generate funding to supplant lost revenue to the trust fund from the motor fuel tax because drivers of EV and hybrid vehicles use the roads but contribute little or nothing in gas tax for the trust fund. The commission heard from Darren Lovas, Chief of Environment and Sustainable Transportation with MDOT, and Colleen Turner, Associate Vice President and Senior Project Manager with Michael Baker International, that 33 states have enacted an EV registration fee and 11 states have proposed an EV registration fee. The commission also heard from MDOT about different revenue projects in Maryland, projections in Maryland were to enact an additional registration fee on hybrid EVs or hybrid vehicles. In looking at modeling options, MVA determined that a $220 fee per EV registration would be an accurate proxy for the average annual gas tax payment by non-EV Maryland vehicle owners. If MVA was authorized to collect an additional $200 registration fee for EVs and hybrid vehicles, the fee would potentially generate $40 million in additional revenue in fiscal 2025 and $118 million in fiscal 2029. Although this would provide a significant new source of revenue to the trust fund and create more equity by assessing a fee to all vehicles, the commission noted that this new revenue alone would not sufficiently supplant funding lost from the decrease in motor fuel tax revenue. In follow-up materials to the commission from MDOT, the department explained that an increase in $10 in all vehicle registration fees would generate an approximately $45 million in annual revenue. Some states have started to add fees based on miles of vehicles traveled, referred to as vehicles mile travel fee, or a road user charge or mileage-based user fee. Maryland has not applied for funding nor conducted any pilot studies. It is, however, a member of the Eastern Transportation Coalition, which has been active in this effort. MDOT indicates that it is committed to being part of the exploratory work being conducted by TETC in phase 5 of this grant. In discussing a recommendation option related to EV fees, commissioners voiced the pros and cons about requiring MVA to collect a new fee. While other states considered or adopted a wide range of EV and hybrid vehicle fees, the commissioners agreed that they could not determine the specific appropriate amount for MVA to collect, how to differentiate fees for EVs and hybrid vehicles, or whether MVA should instead increase registration fees on all vehicles to compensate for the decrease in revenues to the trust fund. Commissioners were cognizant that the imposition of a fee might have a negative impact on the state's effort to encourage adoption of EVs. However, the commission felt that the immediate need for the trust fund warranted making a recommendation and that the state would need to continue to explore other revenue options. The commission intends to consider policies related to vehicles mile travel fees during the 2024 interim. The 2 recommendations in this section that you will be voting on are One, in response to the urgency of the need to find additional revenues in fiscal year 2025, the Commission recommends that the Maryland General Assembly consider in the 2024 legislative session options to collect additional revenue to help offset the loss of revenue to the trust fund from the increased adoption of electric vehicles and/or hybrid vehicles. These options include adding a new registration fee for electric and/or hybrid vehicles, or increasing registration fees for all drivers. The Commission believes that the state should use this increased funding to build out EV infrastructure after the state has maximized the use of available IIJA funding for the same purpose. The second recommendation in this section is that the Commission recommends that MVA explore different fee amounts or payment options for low-income individuals. The second section of the report is related to requiring the Maryland General Assembly to require Maryland Transportation Authority to adjust toll rates on out-of-state easy passes to maximize toll revenue in order to generate new revenues to support Maryland's broader transportation system. At its second meeting, the Commission heard from MDTA. When asked by commissioners, MDTA explained that the toll reductions in 2015 reduced MDTA's revenue by more than $500 million in anticipated revenues over the past 8 fiscal years. Commissioners asked what increased revenue from MDTA could generate from increasing tolls. For illustrated purposes only, DLS completed an analysis of an increase of 50 cents for all vehicles would yield an additional $81 million in additional revenue to MDTA. At the Commission's fourth meeting, DLS provided analysis of what a 50% increase for all out-of-state vehicles would yield, using that as a proxy for what out-of-state easy passes were. It's not perfect, but it's supposed to be a proxy. And that would yield $26.7 million in additional revenue for MDTA. Although MDTA already applies a discounted rate for 2-axle vehicles and Maryland-issued Easy Pass transponders and many of its toll facilities, commissioners were interested in how increased revenue from passenger vehicles with non-Maryland-issued Easy Pass transponders could be deposited into a special fund as a revenue source for transportation-related projects unrelated to tolled highway. So the third recommendation in this section is that the Commission recommends that the Maryland General Assembly require MDTA to adjust toll rates on out-of-state easy passes to maximize toll revenues to generate new revenue to support projects in Maryland's broader transportation system outside of MDTA. This could provide additional resources for public transportation, cycling, pedestrian infrastructure, and transit-oriented development. And the last section in your draft recommendations is that MDOT should reevaluate the prioritization process used for CTP development and project prioritization with the goal of adopting a new, consistent and fair process for the 2026 through 2031 CTP. During the Commission's meetings over the 2023 interim, MDOT sent a survey to stakeholders to solicit input on CTP development and the project prioritization process to generate feedback. Although MDOT has only received 33 responses, the themes in those responses were similar to the concerns that commissioners expressed during presentations during the prioritization process. Common concerns that the Commission heard were that the process was not transparent, it is unclear why a project is or is not funded, and the scoring results are not reflected in projects selected for inclusion in the CTP, and overall fairness in the ability of using one scoring system to compare multiple types of projects. At the third meeting, the Commission heard from other states about how they have tailored their process. There are 3 recommendations in this section. The first recommendation in this section is the Commission recommends that MDOT develop a new draft prioritization process to present to the Commission during the 2024 interim with the goal of implementing a new prioritization process by the 26th through 31 CTP. The current process lacks consistency and uniformity and can be improved to promote fairness. While the Commission was interested in the prioritization processes in Virginia, Illinois, and North Carolina, the Commission was not comfortable recommending the implementation of a specific process and agrees that MDOT should develop a new draft prioritization process with the goal of implementing the new process in the 2631 CTP. The Commission believes that a new process should attach funding decisions to statewide priorities. The next recommendation is that the Commission further recommends that the prioritization process have performance metrics related to safety, accessibility, and mobility, climate change and the environment, equity, economic factors, and land use. The Commission recommends that the prioritization process take into account a number of considerations. I would like to draw your attention to the third bullet that we would like to just make a change in removing airports from the third bullet. The last recommendation is that in developing a prioritization process, MDOT should standardize local priority letters, create a process to provide comments to local governments related to requested projects, and always present a balanced draft CTP in September prior to the local roadshow. And Mr. Chair, those are the draft recommendations that you have put forward for the commission to vote on today. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Corman.
First of all, thanks to you and Michelle and everybody else for the hard work on this. Per your sort of roadmap at the beginning, I would move that we adopt the recommendations.
Thank you. Have a second? Thank you. Now that the recommendations have been properly seconded, is there any discussion that we would like to have on the recommendations in front of us? Commissioner Tolkien.
Thank you. I have a couple clarifying questions. I'd first like to start with. So in section 1 in the recommendation, I noticed that the language had changed from collecting revenue to account for the loss of the revenue to the trust fund to offset the loss. Could you discuss the significance of the language change?
Which page are you on?
Sorry,
Jeff?
page 1, very first item in bold. The third line. It says 2024 session, General Assembly should consider options to collect additional revenue from the Transportation Trust Fund to offset the loss of revenue.
Yeah, I think this, Mr. Chair, this is because we added this additional language, so we just wanted to wordsmith it so that there were verbs attached to clauses.
Okay, I just, so account for versus offset. Offset would seem to me to be fairly binding, mathematical. I just wanted to confirm that that's the intent. Secondly, we had urged that the discussion be limited to electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrids being vehicles that are charging off of the electric grid. Hybrid vehicles are just more efficient vehicles. There's a variety of vehicles that have reduced their miles per gallon. There are plug-in Hummers and there are super efficient Honda Fits. I drive one that is not. So to me, that specifically offsetting the cost for hybrids doesn't really make sense to me as a sort of consistent approach. They're not charging off the grid. They're just more efficient. More importantly, we had urged for the language here to be included, to have the language included non-punitive. I did note that in the overview earlier, I think the number that was quoted was $200 per car, but in the presentation that we heard, that was the pretty high upper end of the fees being considered by states, I believe. And a lot of states have found that they may have unintentionally set fees that were higher than what a person would have actually been paying in the gas tax. So that actually adds to my concern that we might be looking to maximize revenue with this rather than trying to find the precise price point that would bring in what it may have been lost, but not overcharge. So
yeah, and I think that was, an option. I mean, we were trying to provide, the ranges for folks, I mean, for the MBA and others to look at. So I don't think that there's nothing hard set about a $200 figure. It's more of, again, trying to, set the ranges, and that would be something that clearly would have to come back for more discussion.
Okay, so if it's appropriate, I would propose that the words non-punitive at a minimum be added when qualifying what the registration fee would be. My preference, though it's longer and technical, would be to add the words, I think, for a miles per gallon equivalent, or consistent with miles per gallon equivalent.
Where are you, Josh, where are you adding that? Suggestion?
Into the bold recommendation on number 1.
Oh.
Should have prepared to be speaking first, but let me see. The exact language that we would recommend would be the fee would be based on imputed fuel economy of each EV as calculated by the EPA.
Okay.
essentially that's a way to try to estimate what the lost revenue per vehicle is. That way we are taking into account the different impact on the roadways of a 2,000-pound vehicle versus a small electric vehicle opposed to a flat fee.
Yeah, I think we can talk that through with the department and circle back with you.
So I would like to, I have raised this before, so if appropriate, I'd like to propose it as an amendment and have a vote on it. And I did say I sent it in advance specifically so that it would be something that could be considered. I think the two options, and maybe we can take a straw poll of people's comfort, would be either the technical option is imputed fuel economy, the fallback option is non-punitive.
Mr. Chair, may I recommend, I'm having a hard time tracking where we're going. If I could ask our staff, Carrie, to pull you out for 1 second, Commissioner Tolkien, so we can get exactly what you'd like drafted. And then we can all see what that looks like while we move on to other commissioners. Would you be okay with that?
Sure.
Thank you. Carrie, do you mind? Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Thompson?
Hear me? Okay, there you go. First, let me say thank you for your leadership. I know this is tough. We all been reading the headlines, all been getting the calls and text messages about this. Everyone's really concerned. I want to say that I sent some a letter, and I didn't see my recommendation in here, so I'm going to make it appeal to you and to the committee. I strongly recommend the consideration of a proposed transportation and infrastructure and environmental bond act. This funding mechanism could be utilized to support a variety of initiatives, including the procurement of clean energy vehicles, infrastructure upgrades, and the purchase of low to zero emission vehicles across the state. By leveraging such a bond act, the state can continue to make substantial progress in advancing its commitment to sustainable transportation solutions. New York State, where I had the opportunity to serve in the legislature, we talked about it for years, and they finally passed one last year. And it's going to really help them leverage some of the federal bipartisan infrastructure law money, Inflation Reduction Act money, so they can continue to reach their goals. I think many people are concerned that not only would these potential cuts have an impact budgetarily speaking, but will it slow our progress to reach our climate goals? And so I think a bond act, while it won't be a panacea, I think it would be an awesome opportunity for us to let the voters decide next year if the legislature still fee it and the governor agrees to take it up. It helps us continue down the road, but we're still going to have to do all the other six things that you talked about. But I think the seventh item would send a signal to local state leaders and the private sector and all the clean energy groups and transportation groups that work so hard on climate solutions now and the nation, that we get it and that we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So hopefully you take that into consideration and think about that. We're only making a recommendation to the legislature. They don't have to do it. The governor doesn't have to do it. But I think we should send a signal to the industry and to all these mayors and supervisors and state officials that are all in the news that we understand we're listening. And it's up to them and the voters to decide whether or not Maryland wants a transportation, infrastructure, and environmental bond act in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Chang.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. Wanted to refer to the first recommendation, refers to in the 2024 legislative session, the General Assembly should consider options to collect additional revenue for Transportation Trust Fund to offset the loss of revenue to the trust fund from the increased adoption for the electric and hybrid vehicles, including adding a new registration fee for electric and hybrid vehicles, other additional or differential registration fees, or increasing registration fees for all drivers. The registration fees are also support critical programs outside of transportation, specifically the University of Maryland Shock Trauma, our trauma system is one of the best in the world, has a 98% success rate. And these are because of the investments we make as a state, and would like to offer a recommendation of adding additional wording within this, that after increasing registration fees for all drivers, that we could insert acknowledging the current commitments supported by registration fees outside of transportation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Hershey.
Thank you very much. Just, I guess I certainly have questions on all of these, but the first recommendation that, let me make sure I got the right one. The electric vehicle registration fees that we talked about. As I understood it, there were two specific reasons on why we were looking to have an increase or a new electric vehicle registration. And one was very simply stated here, because drivers of EVs, hybrid vehicles, use the roads but contribute little or nothing in gas tax to the Transportation Trust Fund. So this was an act of fairness in the sense they should be paying to use the roads just like any other vehicles do. But the second main point, and all of this discussion, was related to how do we compensate for the decrease in revenue into the Transportation Trust Fund. So as I think that we've gotten, and Josh isn't in the room anymore, but to all of Josh's points, how prescriptive are we supposed to be getting with regards to our recommendations? I mean, that should occur in the legislative process in my eyes. I mean, this commission should come up with some ideas and say to the legislature, here are our ideas, and you debate where all of this is going, because the fact that we are even mentioning that the commission believes that the state should use the increased funding to build out EV infrastructure is ridiculous. That's not the charge that we had. It was to find out how to pay for EV infrastructure. It was to how do we compensate for the decrease in the gas tax, and the money's going into transportation trust funds. And then we're going to make a very specific recommendation that that money that comes in should be used for that specific source or for those specifics. So I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I also don't recall that we talked about a broad across the board $10 increase on all vehicles registration. And again, if so, that becomes in part of the same recommendation. One, that we're also saying that that money should go for EV charging stations and infrastructure. Again, I don't think that that was the intent of all the commissioners here, but I guess we'll see when this comes time for a vote. On the second recommendation, the commission recommends that MVA explore different fee amounts for the payment option for low-income individuals. I would just ask MVA, are we doing this with any other fees? Are we doing this with vehicle registration fees? Are we doing this with titling fees? Why all of a sudden have we found, do we want to acknowledge that owners of EVs, don't have enough money to pay for a simple registration fee like all other vehicles are paying? So I'm concerned with that as well. The last recommendation, or not the last one, but the third one, where we talk about increasing tolls for out-of-state Easy Pass users. What I continue to hear is that could be in violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause and the Contract Clause. And I don't believe that our AG's opinion discussed that adequately. They discussed the diversion theory, which is taking additional revenue and taking revenue from the tolls and putting it into other transportation users, but they did not fully discuss whether or not we could raise the fees or the tolls on out-of-state vehicles. And I do see we're playing around with the language, and I'm not sure if this is any difference is saying, what I have seen in the previous is that you can provide a discount rate for in-state users. And I don't know if this is splitting hairs or not to say, well, we can discount rates for in-state, or are we actually saying we want to raise rates for out-of-state? And, if you are allowed to discount rates, in a sense, that would be saying that the governor would have to go to his appointees on the MDTA and tell them to vote for a toll increase so the legislature could come back and decrease it for in-state users. Because I don't think we can increase the tolls for strictly out-of-state users. And I don't think that this AG's opinion said that specifically. And again, then we go to the diversion theory on can we raise tolls and use that additional revenue for, again, not to necessarily make up for the loss in the transportation trust fund, but now we're going to recommend for public transportation, cycling, pedestrian infrastructure, and transit oriented development. So again, we're being so specific to say raise tolls for out-of-staters, but then here's what we're going to use. We're going to make sure that the cyclists and pedestrians, that we're doing enough that we can for that. I don't think that that's where the transportation trust fund has its major problems in trying to, build enough cycling and walking, access. There's broader problems of that. So again, I'm very concerned that we are this prescriptive in our recommendations. So I'll say that with the first three.
Okay.
The other two don't bother me as much. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Senator Hershey. And we've talked about this offline. I just want to be clear that the AG's letter does state that if we were to raise tolls on out-of-state vehicles, that would violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. That is why we took great pain in this language saying out-of-state easy passes, which other states have done and have, been successful at doing. The two states that were flagged by the AGs had different issues, which we believe this language addresses, and that we are not charging different increases in tolls or not recommending maximizing by different axles. It would be a uniform maximization, and it would be on the easy passes. So I just want to be clear for the record, because there is an issue with out-of-state drivers, and that is not what this is doing. Thanks.
If I just might add to that, and I'd like to make sure that we're very clear, because what I understand the other states did was discount for in-state users of an easy pass, which again, I think is very different than what our recommendation is. Our recommendation is not to discount for in-state users. Our recommendation is to increase for out-of-state drivers using easy pass, right?
Well, the recommendation, Senator, is to maximize, and that's the recommendation. But you are flagging that in the AG's opinion, one state did get into trouble by discounting in-state easy passes, and therefore the out-of-state easy passes were supplanting revenue of in-state easy pass holders, which raised a flag. And we believe that's not what this language says, and therefore stand by it. So.
And I, to your broader point, Senator, I mean, we're not drafting bills here today. We are providing as much guidance as possible for the General Assembly, the administration, and the department to consider within the three recommendations that we have. So I appreciate that there is a level of specificity, but at the end of the day, the General Assembly is going to have to make some decisions around this. And our job is to try to give them as broad a latitude as possible for the purposes of being able to move these things forward in some reasonable fashion. So I take your points very seriously, but at the same time, I would really like to level set with the entire group to understand that, this is guidance for the purposes of trying to, to attempt to address these issues that the department and the administration are trying to work in concert with the General Assembly on. So. Commissioner Winstead.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Just to the senator's point, I think he raises some very strong arguments here. One of the strengths of the department is the multimodal capability and planning and listening to alternative transportation needs and being able to make that decision and represent that decision through the CTP to the legislature. And so restricting to certain uses in some of our recommendations, in my opinion, I concur with the senator on that. Secondly, on the easy pass out of state, we did a very good job of referencing that 4 states have in fact either adopted 33 and 11 considering EV registration. And that's a very, I think, powerful tool. That's a vast majority of states that are looking at this. Similarly, if, Michelle, you said there were 2 states that allow for higher EV, easy pass rates. I would just mention how many states have actually done this. The Northeast Corridor states that have allowed for out-of-state easy pass adjustment in rates for out-of-state travelers, and nationwide, because, you know, easy pass is all over. I would just mention the states that have actually adopted that. I think it's a strong argument to include how it's been used by other states.
Yeah, we can, Mr. Chair, we can add that narrative, the unbolded language in the final report. I'm staring at Steve to get me those states, but I don't have them off the top of my head. So acknowledging, we will include that as background information.
They're comfortable in, you know, in striking, you know, the last line in the 3rd recommendation, Senator, then I certainly would support that. Commissioner Sakata.
Thank you. A lot of questions about number 3, Rec 3. But similarly to Senator Hershey's and under the guidance theme, just a clarifying theme, similar to that, you know, what was the rationale in not providing to allocate the monies go back to the TTF? Yeah, the new revenue. It's currently states obviously going to the Maryland's broader transportation system outside of MDTA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what the chair is putting forward is being silent on where that money
Okay.
goes. So that would be the recommendation now on the table.
I would definitely make a move to recommendation to have that amended.
I'll accept that. Yes. Thank you. It's Commissioner Kane. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On recommendation 1, there should be a fee, actually, because this is for the public good. They're all using our roads, so there should be a buy-in. I would recommend that you strike the last sentence about the state should utilize funding from the trust fund to build out EV infrastructure in the state. I think that's up to MDOT to decide where this money goes. So that I don't think it's in our purview to tell them where to put their money. And so then also for recommendation 2, I have to agree with Senator Hershey on where else are we deciding who can afford to pay registration fees and who not? I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to implement. And how are you going to do that? So I would also leave that up to MDOT. And I agree with the last recommendation to strike the last sentence of recommendation 3.
On the first recommendation.
Yes.
The last line.
Yes.
I'm comfortable if others are of striking that last line of that first recommendation. Yeah, the commission believes that the state should use an increased funding to build out EV infrastructure after the state has maximized the use of that sentence. Okay. And in the second recommendation, the commission recommends that the MBA explore different fee amounts would stay.
Mhm.
Okay.
And then agree with the recommendation 3 to strike the last sentence.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I do agree with Senator Hershey on a vast majority of his points. And I do believe that the prescriptive nature here is a bit strong. While Senator Hershey and I might want to prescribe funds to different things, that is very much the job of MDOT to make those decisions. And I trust that process is in place and that the additions and revisions to that process that we're discussing will alleviate any further concerns.
Okay.
Secondly, when it has to do with the toll revenues, the big change in this draft is that we're talking only on out-of-state vehicles. And Out-of-state easy passes, thank you. And I do want to highlight that our toll rates have been frozen for quite some time. And as it was initially drafted, this would allow the MDTA to maximize tolls on all drivers, and to then thereafter, decide how to do that. So I do think that we are very much decreasing the revenue generating capability here if we are only focusing on out-of-state easy passes. And there certainly could be room for some incremental increases. As you know, Mr. Chair, I have concerns about the location of these tolls being almost solely in the greater Baltimore area. But that is a issue for another day and a broader conversation. But in the meantime, there's certainly room for growth, both in-state and out-of-state. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. I'm not sure which commissioner at the end. God, y'all are bunched up down there.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I couldn't keep track of whether we excised the last line on recommendation 1, but this is more of kind of a comment and a request to MDOT and less of a issue with the language. But in trying to understand how the state has attempted to maximize available IIJA funding, I mean, certainly we understand there are lots of different pots of funding for IIJA, specifically EV infrastructure, and also understand that both the state and local governments are seeking to both apply for funding and receive formula funds. Was just wondering, if MDOT at some point could also, speak to how they are attempting to maximize use of IIJA funding. Certainly, we're aware that there are obviously a lot of, items that USDOT is, encourages states to adopt and both in grant guidance and in general policy. Speaking on behalf of the building trades unions, there are workforce development components and training programs that federal government, heavily encourages applicants to adopt that, I think we would probably benefit from hearing from MDOT about both, their own plans for use of existing funds and also strategies to both increase, state allocation of IIJA funding and to provide like basic technical guidance to localities applying for similar pots of discretionary funding. So probably just not as relevant to the to changing language, but also just perhaps a topic of conversation at another point for MDOT to be able to to show kind of state policymakers how we're looking to maximize existing funding before the state allocates additional resources.
Great. Thank you. We will take that on as a follow-up item, if that's okay, Commissioner. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Commissioner Laria.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess we can get to this at a later date, but I'm struggling a little bit with the limits of our role here, this conversation that we're having, and maybe it will become more important or more relevant as we get into the next year's work. But, with due respect, of course, the legislators are here who ultimately have to make with the decisions with the administration, MDOT, the governor, et cetera. We have to sort of find a course between here's some stuff you should think about and here's what we think you should do. And that tension is inherent in this discussion. I don't mean in a bad way, but that tension is inherent in this discussion because to some extent, we have to do some policy analysis. We have to do some pre-digestion and we have to frame the issues a bit, I think. Although, of course, the legislators, their own staffs, the DLS will do that again during the session. So I'm just struggling a little bit with that because that's what it's like, well, should we say this or should we say that? Well, I don't know if we all agree that if we all agree that we agree, then are we precluded because of the deference and which is due. So I don't know where that goes, but in hearing this conversation, which is the first time we've had a conversation about recommendations, right. I'm a little bit struck. And since we're not done now, but we have a whole other year, at some point we probably should figure that out. In terms of how we're going to handle the next set of recommendations. And I just want to offer a couple of other quick,
No, I appreciate that perspective, Commissioner, and you and I have discussed that. And it is, I mean, if I had my druthers, certainly there would be, a lot of other conversations in this conversation, but I also am, trying to, to walk the line relative to the charge of the commission, understanding that there are a lot of external factors that are currently taking place at the same time. So I feel that as well. So I just wanted to,
thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, with all these senior legislators here and others, the question is not whether we should be presumptuous. The question is, how can we be helpful? And that's the question. And I just want to make sure that we're figuring that out as we go, because I'm concerned that just sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, may not be as helpful as, we've thought about this and here's what we think you should do. Or here's what we think you should do, but maybe is variation 1A and 1B. With respect to these recommendations, I'm also trying to figure out, I'm assuming that they're not really intended to be preclusive, and that they're more foundational. And I think also, people have asked me, and I'm sure others, about the commission and what's expected in this cycle, et cetera. And I think people have to recognize that we haven't been at this very long. We started off not that many months ago. We had the necessary baseline setting and all the things, which I think was absolutely essential. And then in the middle of it lands the CTP and a $3 billion deficit. And what are we supposed to do about that? So there's only so much you can really do in this little period of time before the General Assembly. And I'm sure that there'll be a debate among the legislators and the executive branch and so on about what that looks like. But what are we supposed to say? And I just want to make sure that at least what we're saying is not preclusive. For example, the question about out-of-state easy passes. Let me say it this way. I feel like if the recommendations all began with, at this point, right, the commission recommends or what, because that's kind of how I feel, right? I don't really know whether we ought to recommend increases in toll rates across the board, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it's easy to say now out-of-state easy passes because the out-of-state people aren't here, so we just sort of say out-of-state easy passes. But we need to figure out about toll rates. And for example, a very helpful sentence that I found in this, and I know it's just a sentence, but it's a hook to hang it on. The commission intends to consider policies related to VMT during the 2024 session. We have to take those things on, and people have to understand there may be some things that we can do right now, but it cannot preclude us. And I want to put a little bit of a marker down. It can't preclude us from having other conversations about adjustment in toll rates. That's one big issue. The other big issue would be what I'll paraphrase as the outside of MDTA issue inherent in recommendation number 3. It's a big discussion to be had about whether MDTA revenues can or should be used. We've decided apparently to excise the last sentence, which is fine in that recommendation, but it's still a question of revenues outside of MDTA and what might be used outside of MDTA. So we've just got to keep those issues before us. And I don't want this to be, we've made these recommendations, that's all we have to say on the subject, because I really do think there's much more to say. And we're constrained by time and practicality at this point. And so those are my comments. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I share your perspective on that, Commissioner. So thank you. Commissioner Ball.
I just want to echo the points of Commissioner Laria. How can we be helpful and what is our charge? Right now, we have, and first of all, to the team who put this together and did the research, thank you so much. It's fantastic. I think as we're looking at it, if we have a more than $3 billion deficit, is our goal or charge to help address that? Or is it just to say these are some general things that you might want to look at? And if it is the latter, I think we have a lot more work to be done to evaluate what makes sense. Some of this conversation that we're having now, I feel might be a bit, I think we can have a more thorough conversation around some of these issues than frankly we can have today. And, I just want us to be thoughtful and mindful of, our goal, our charge, and how we can be helpful. And to the commissioner's point, I recognize we have the holidays and then we have session. And our General Assembly is going to be having some significant conversations and important decisions to make in very short order. So I just want to make sure that we are kind of taking a step back, recognizing that we still have more work to do, and seeing what we can do that's most productive at this challenging point in the transportation revenue discussion of our state.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that. Commissioner Thompson.
Yeah, I just want to find out from you, Mr. Chairman, regarding my letter about a month ago. I spoke, you didn't really say anything, so I want to know what's the process to get a recommendation to the legislature and the governor on the transportation infrastructure and environmental bond act proposal that could help them address some of the infrastructure and transportation needs. And we're only making a recommendation. I don't know what the process is to, because you all came up with the list and we all gave some suggestions. I gave you a nice little letter dated November 14th. And I want to see that bond act recommendation to the legislature. And I want to know what the process is. Do we get to vote on it? Is this a unilateral decision or is it a group decision? I think it needs it. I've seen a lot of folks saying, what are they going to do? Are they going to throw us a lifeline? People are scared. There's got bridges crumbling. And so I think the Transportation Infrastructure and Environmental Bond Act can address a number. It's not a panacea, but let them figure out, is it 2 million, 2 billion, 3 billion, 1 billion, whatever that number is. But I think we should send a signal to the market, to the legislators, that we've got to do these other 6 things, but this is something you should take into consideration. Other states are doing it. It supplements the other federal funding, because some of the states going to have a challenge on making some of that match money. This could help with that as well. So I just want to know what the process is. Thanks.
The staff did take a look at that. So Michelle, if you want to.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we posted all commissioner comments and all public comments on the hearing schedule for the public and circulated to all members of this commission, which includes legislators. I just wanted to ground us in what is the process right now. So we are debating the chair's recommendations. The chair does not have that in his recommendations. So once we are finished with his recommendations, if you wanted to put that forward as a separate recommendation, that would be the appropriate time to do that.
Thank you. I respectfully appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Sure. Commissioner Kane, or was Banks?
It was me this time.
Okay. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to note, I think my agreement with several of the previous comments, Commissioners Henninger and Laria, specifically on the tolls issues. In the follow-up materials, we learned that the toll reductions in 2015 reduced MDTA's revenue by approximately $500 million over those, ensuing years. And so while I'm okay with recommendation 3, and, as Commissioner Laria, I think, noted, this is our recommendation at this time, but I do think that we should continue to explore or urge the legislature to explore tolls in a broader sense, and perhaps recovering some of that. I suppose we can't recover the lost revenue, but looking into the future and seeing if a broader increase in tolls across the board might not also be a viable place to offset some of this deficit. So thank you.
Commissioner Tolkien, you're up.
Thank you. Was this the appropriate time to bring back the proposed edits?
Yes.
I was wondering if, the council would be able to help me present those.
I was going to say, Mr. Chair, for procedure, it seems like what Commissioner Tolkien is asking for is an alternative to recommendation 1, which the staff is passing out right now.
Okay.
I would recommend for clarity that we vote on recommendations 2 through 6 with the changes which I can highlight based on the discussion right now. And then after that, have a discussion on the alternative to recommendation 1 that Commissioner Tolkien is putting forward. I think that's the most appropriate step.
I'm completely fine with that. As people are reading it, I will note that there is overlapping language between the bolded section at the very, very start of section 1, recommendation 1 that's in bold, and then the item that's actually called recommendation 1. So just assume that the proposed changes would be reflected in both iterations. So I'm fine with that. I did have one last question about the 3rd bullet in recommendation 5, equitable allocation of funds to expand and improve our roads, bridges, rail transit, and bus transit. I'm just curious what is intended by that. Like, do we mean that each of those things would get an equal amount?
No, I think we would have used the word equal allocation there. This is just to acknowledge that, we should take into account. It was asked for, I apologize. It was asked for as a recommendation.
Yeah, I'm trying to
I'm
remember.
trying to remember why.
Acknowledging the relative importance of each of these to different
Yes.
communities would be great, and I would strongly support that. The words equitable allocation to me would sort of throw me off, and I wonder if people could later debate what was meant by that, but I'm not going to follow my sword on it.
I think let me give a thought to a different phrase there, but I think what you were explaining was the intent. It was not to say it should be an equal pie distributed to each of these options.
Right.
So if we're all agreeing that that is the intent, I'm happy to make a change to that piece.
Okay,
Great, thank you.
so do we want to go through the current set of changes before addressing specifically Commissioner Tolkien's question?
There are a couple more commissioners who have questions or alterations, so I would go through
Okay.
those to see if we can get any consensus and move
Okay.
forward.
Commissioner Flora.
To Larry's point, I'm looking at the charge that we have in front of us, and these all look like items that are more related to our findings in our reporting and our summary, not specific recommendations at this stage. So I am sharing the concern about the notion of, are these our interim findings in terms of this is what the analysis, the research, we've done a lot of information, which we should bring forward, I think, but to jump straight to recommendations, I am also a bit uncomfortable with, and I feel it's more of interim findings that can be utilized as a summary report at this stage for the legislature to either begin to act on in the 2024 session or allow us to continue our work for the next year. So I just wanted to share where I'm at with that in terms of looking at the charge that's in front of us.
Thank you. Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank Commissioners Banks and Lauria for their positive comments in support of my broadening of the statement here around adjusting toll rates. And I would like to introduce a motion or move that we do strike the language here around the out of state, just the words out of state, given both the legal complexities and the perhaps even more real funding complexities that would introduce. Thank you.
I mean, we added that to make sure that we weren't addressing the optimal tolling issues. So I would reject that as a proposal to the group. But, I mean, this is something that we need to clearly get a sense of the body on.
Would there not be a way to get around both issues using some creative language?
Yeah, I think we thought the original recommendation used that creative language. We were flagged by a number of your colleagues that it felt like the recommendation was moving towards optimal tolling, which they weren't comfortable with doing. So we wanted that to be clear what this recommendation was actually speaking to.
We could say, for instance, marginal increase.
Well, I think you're recommending removing out-of-state easy passes. And I think a marginal increase gets into that area, which your commissioner colleagues are comfortable doing. So I think that is why we made this clear of what tolls we were considering, the commission was considering.
Will we be able to bring this to a vote of my commissioner colleagues? Because I was not there when that concern was introduced, so.
Yeah, it was in commissioner feedback and public comments that we circulated to you, but at the chair's request, you're more than welcome to pull out this recommendation as well as recommendation 1 for alternatives. Great.
Sure. Yep. Commissioner Ackerman. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that, Kurtwell.
And I could speak, Josh, to the third bullet on recommendation 5, but I was basically trying to point out what you just said, that we look at all the different modes and try to be equitable in how we spread things out, not equal there. And I would bring up on that one, I know you decided to remove airports, and I just wanted to kind of confirm why I added that in there. You know, BWI is separate, and I wasn't really looking to try to, you know, that BWI needs to have a scoring system for projects compared to our other general aviation airports. But we have, I think, what is it, 15 or 17 total smaller general aviation airports, 2 do commercial service. I know Salisbury, Hagerstown, they have commercial service, but they're small rural airports compared to, of course, BWI. The other 15 are general aviation, which includes Martin State. And I know all those airports have different projects that they try to do to try to improve their performance along the way. And I wasn't really, I thought they could have a scoring system and compete as well. When you have, instead of just kind of funding the state-owned airport and seeing what was left for the other 15, we kind of look at that. So that was the point of putting it in there. If it needs to be pulled out, it's not something I'm dying over, but it was just something I wanted to add. The only other point I had was in the beginning. There's a comment in the first recommendation about the commissioners raised concern that an increased registration fee for EVs may discourage individuals from choosing to purchase an EV. And I don't necessarily disagree with that if you look at it a different way, but I thought the presentations we saw, they had did some surveys and research on, did the registration of EVs change when they raised the fee, and it showed that they did not change. In other words, they kept growing. They did not see any impact. I thought that was the presentation that we got, that there wasn't an impact based on the data that we saw. So to me, this implies there was data that showed something different, depending on how you want to interpret it. But that was the only other objection I have. And then last thing I'd say, I appreciate the effort of staff and everybody putting in some different comments from the different commissioners, and I know that's not easy, and I thought you did a good job there.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to respond to the middle point, and thank you for the appreciation, is that is in there, that sentence about commissioners concerned would discourage individuals, but it's followed with the sentence of, however, according to MDOT, that concern has not been validated in states with EV registration fees. So I think we tried to strike that balance in that language.
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Ali.
Chair, thank you again to staff for all of your hard work on this. Quick question, and I don't know, maybe it's just a point of clarity. So for the electric vehicles and the hybrid registrations, and I believe it's an additional fee on top of the other registration fee?
Where this recommendation is at this point is acknowledging the decrease in revenue to the trust fund because of hybrid and electric vehicles, but proposing options for the General Assembly to consider in the 2024 legislative session, which includes a specific registration fee, increasing registration fees for all vehicles, or other differential registration rates. So the recommendation is no longer a specific registration fee for hybrid and electrics. It's options acknowledging the situation we're in right now.
Understood. So when we say including either adding a new registration fee for electric and hybrid vehicles, that would not be an additional fee, but basically maybe an increase to the existing fee. If you have an electric vehicle or hybrid, that you would pay a little more versus you'd pay the registration fee and an additional fee?
No, I think it would be a new fee, new registration fee on top of the current registration fee for hybrid and electric vehicles is an option that this recommendation flags for the General Assembly as something to consider. As it is something other states do.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And just curious.
Oh, I'm sorry.
VA determined that a $220 fee per EV registration would be about right. I don't know, is that right, Chrissy? But that the average EV fee, I guess, in other states is about 128. We're not suggesting what that amount should be.
No,
in
we
our recommendation.
actually even acknowledge that as commissioners, you did not feel it was appropriate to speak on the correct amount to do.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then in recommendation 3, I agree with striking the last sentence. And I also agree with Commissioner, I can't see her name in the corner, about findings. I just kind of feel like, versus recommendations, I feel like our charge is obviously somewhat limited, and recognizing that the legislature will do what the legislature will do, but I don't know, I feel a little uncomfortable with some of them as quote unquote recommendations instead of sort of findings and what we've learned from the presentations and our conversations leading up to this. Thank
No,
you.
that's a fair point that was made. I acknowledge that. So, I mean, I think we can, we're flexible people. We can find a way to get where we need to be. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm trying to figure out. Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation about the specificity of the recommendations wholeheartedly, and I know that we've talked about that around the table here today. And I'd like to talk about recommendation number 3 a little bit in more detail, because we struck the last sentence, I believe, that seems to be the general consensus. But we're also still saying we want to have that toll increase to be used for transportation projects outside of the MDTA. So I have a bit of a problem with that because you know, I don't know that we've concluded that MDTA has sufficient monies in their enterprise account to cover all of their expenses for the foreseeable future. If in fact they would have to come back and raise tolls for a bridge project that would be necessary, and you tell the public, hey, well, we just raised tolls. Well, that was for sidewalks and bike trails and highways. We didn't use it for our MDTA, you know, initiatives. So it makes it difficult going forward into the future. And not only that, there in the narrative early on and prior to the recommendation, there is a process by which MDTA can transfer excess funds if they have them over to the trust fund. And that involves the Secretary and the General Assembly, the Board of Public Works. So there is a mechanism in place for that to occur, you know, outside of this specific recommendation. Say, let's raise tolls for other projects outside the MDTA. So I would agree that this could be a finding that we need to raise tolls, but leave it to the General Assembly and the work of this group to figure out how those revenues would be best utilized for the system overall.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that, looking more closely at the charge of the commission, it is both findings and recommendations. So I think, we can definitely, find a path forward for the conversations. Understanding that we're not tying people to what the end result is, because I'm not here drafting bills currently. So. Commissioner Kane? No, sorry.
Not to beat the toll issue to death, but I do think that, you know, my reading of the Attorney General's letter, I think, is that this recommendation could be worded in a way that does not violate that Commerce Clause issue. And I think even just changing the word, you know, if we were to do what Commissioner Henninger is suggesting and remove the out-of-state easy passes, if we changed, for instance, required to authorize, I think that would, based on, again, I probably need to read the Attorney General's letter again, because it's quite detailed, but I think that could be enough to avoid the issue that I think, Michelle, you were raising. I personally agreed with the original way that this was written before the edits were made. And then I understand, you know, there are some concerns with that. So I don't know whether, you know, this is appropriate to do today or whether this is something that we just want to consider in the future. But I do think that there are ways to word that sentence that would address the concerns that were raised by the Attorney General's office, but also perhaps allow for a broader evaluation of tolls, not just on the out-of-state easy passes.
Thank you. Commissioner Stevens?
Yes. Thank you to the staff for this incredible work and including all these variety of perspectives. I was comfortable with the striking of the sentence that specifically calls out the area that I'm representing, cycling and pedestrian, because of the language that the new revenue could support Maryland's broader transportation system outside of MDTA. So I would feel comfortable if we left that phrasing in, and that is the intent, and that's what I understood from reading the background. And I also would support the comments that the other commissioners made, and I thought the earlier language that looked at recommendations for toll rates in general, not just the out-of-state toll rates, as a consideration, looking at that language to look at we're here to try to bring in the greatest amount of revenue to offset the deficit. So I would suggest considering the language that's whether it's taking out require and making it authorize, or using language that says recommends considering additional rate tolls for across the board. That would be my recommendation.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Commissioner.
So I think, would it be possible to adopt items 2, and I think it's 4, 5, and 6, I think are the ones you have consensus on? And then continuing the conversation on 1 and 3?
That would be great. So we can.
Mr. Chair, I would just add 5, we would change bullet point 3 instead of equitable allocation to appropriate allocation. I think understanding the intent that we all just talked about here on the record, removing airports. Those are the only changes we talked about that aren't reflected in the document that you all have. Thank you.
Do I have a second? Okay. Okay.
Mr. Chair, you have a motion and a second on the floor.
Those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed?
Just for the record, Senator Hershey has raised his hand. Opposed? Anybody else have their hand raised for the record? Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, we have an alternative to recommendation 1, which was passed out by staff and is on your desk, that Commissioner Tolkien is offering. Commissioner Tolkien, do you want to walk through the change that you're offering? And then I believe as staff, we've worked on an alternative to recommendation 3. So we will start with recommendation 1, Commissioner Tolkien.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just read it in its entirety. So in the 2024 session, the Maryland General Assembly should consider options to collect additional revenue from Transportation Trust Fund to offset the loss of revenue of trust fund from question about typo there, but not mine, of electric, and the first change here is plug-in hybrid vehicles. So that's a change from hybrid vehicles to plug-in hybrid vehicles, including a non-punitive registration fee for electric and again, new plug-in hybrid vehicles based on predicted revenue of an equivalent gas-powered vehicle. I was notified that imputed fuel costs and other such terms may take up a lot of commission time wondering what we meant. So what we meant was that you would set the fee based on a calculable cost of what an equivalent vehicle would pay in the average year, and thereby make sure that the fees charged to a electric Hummer are different than the fees charged to a smaller, much more efficient electric vehicle. There are three components I would urge people to consider: the replacement of hybrid vehicles with plug-in hybrids, the inclusion of the word non-punitive, which I think captures the fact that we're trying to make them equivalent, and then my more technical attempt to capture the ethos in the final language. I'm hoping to get some of this adopted, so if any of it gives anybody heartburn, I would welcome to articulate that.
Is there a second? Seconded. Okay.
Then you're learning.
I believe Commissioner Thompson made a second. Is that correct? Yes, great. So the motion, there's a motion on the floor, has been seconded. I think if you wanted to do any discussion, Mr. Chair, there are a couple of people who have flagged their mics. Thanks.
Commissioner Ball.
I guess I have a little bit of concern about the language around non-punitive and based on predicted revenue of an equivalent gas-powered vehicle. I feel as though those may be very subjective in nature, and I think they may not necessarily be as helpful with our goal of basically, and I think I want to lean more toward the finding and preliminary recommendation phase as opposed to the final recommendation phase. And when I see this language, I think it causes maybe more confusion than it actually clarifies.
Thank you, Commissioner. I share your concern as it relates to this. I mean, we've had, a lot of discussion this afternoon relative to the specific nature of recommendations and then the general nature of recommendations. And now we are veering very closely into a very specific area. So I would move to reject this. Commissioner Feldmar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification question as we look at this this proposed alternative compared to what stands now in the document as recommendation 1. I believe this text was pulled from the introduction to the first section. So it also includes other differential registration fees, which is not in recommendation 1. And I just wanted to clarify if that was intentionally omitted from recommendation 1 and sort of understand that it's in the first part, but not in the actual recommendation and what the thinking was there.
That was my error. It is not intentional, and the bold at the top of section 1 should be a straight copy and paste of what will be recommendation 1 at the bottom. So that is a technical error and will be corrected.
Thank you. Commissioner Flora.
Thank you. I definitely agree with the plug-in. That's just I think an editorial thing to ensure we're talking about the right types of cars. But I have a broader concern, and that's the methodology. I don't think we can solve that here today. But if we look at the methodology and the fee structure we've used for the last 100 years, now we're looking at a fee structure that's based on replacing the fuel tax essentially with these alternatives. But I just feel like it may not be the right methodology as we look forward, because there's other ways of really looking at this particular situation. I mean, we should have maybe we should have a carbon tax, I mean, maybe we should have some type of other option that really looks at the next 100 years of transportation and mobility. And so there's just an overriding concern that we're jumping quickly to the EV solution to substitute for the gas tax. I don't have the answer to that, which is what I hope will evolve over the next few months. I would love to know if there's been any research. Maybe we should be the leader in coming up with that other methodology rather than just looking at what other states have done. But I feel like we don't have enough information yet to know what's the next 100 years in mobility, and should we be creating a different approach. It's just an overriding comment. I can live with this for now if we put in the plug-in, but I really think we're not broadening the research and the discussion enough to really look at this bigger issue as it moves forward. And we're not looking at, charging that the whole equation of really moving against vehicles that are reducing our carbon footprint, but we're not really focusing on the vehicles that still have a carbon footprint. So I'm just wondering if we're really creating conflicting policy by this, and that concerns me. So
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I definitely could, support, the plug-in suggestion that you make. So thank you for that. Commissioner Sakata.
Understand the non-punitive component. I understand that, we want to make sure that these EV plugins all pay their fair share. Obviously, 100 years ago, when the gas tax was created, I don't think they had plugins and all those other things. So I guess what was the original intent? And to me, it just seems, I think with Calvin Ball suggesting some confusing a little bit.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Hender.
Thank you. I would agree with Commissioner Ball, and I would also strongly agree with Commissioner Flora on the overarching comment here. And I would agree that the equivalent statement is perhaps the most concerning. That has to do with consumer preference, size of vehicle. It really becomes quite complicated. And non-punitive as well is largely a moral statement, which perhaps does not factor in as well to this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Scott.
Yes, I would agree on the concerns about the non-punitive being very subjective, but also if I could ask Commissioner Nicer, if this was given to you as something to implement, how difficult would it be to implement something with varied fees based on the weight of a vehicle? Or is there something that, because I believe that the concept has merit for sure. So just trying to figure out if there's a way we could get towards the end goal of having a varied fees based on the weight that wouldn't be, every single vehicle having a slightly different fee.
Fee structure, registration fees is based on the weight of a vehicle, right? It's a range based on vehicle weight that is passed to us at the origination of the initial registration and titling of the vehicle. And so I think what some of the commissioners, the points they're making in terms of the clarity of what exactly are we trying to equivocate, because weight is already weighed into registration. So based on that understanding, then what are we trying to have as that additive value to account for here is probably what we would need clarity for if this was the policy that was then adopted by the legislature.
Okay. Thank you, Kirsty. Appreciate that. Commissioner Kane.
I would agree, non-punitive is not something that should really be put into this because it's a fee. It's across the board. And I would stick with our first recommendation the way it was without the last sentence. I just think we don't have this is actually to fill up, we're losing money on the gas tax So how are we going to fill that transportation trust fund? And all of these vehicles use these roads that need to be taken care of. So I think that's the basis. I agree with Calvin Ball on his comments that we need to look at findings and all of that, but really I would stick with recommendation 1 as it was presented without the last sentence.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Commissioner Tolkien.
Thank you. So non-punitive came from the Consumer Reports article that we sent around earlier this year. Rising trend of punitive fees on electric vehicles won't dent state highway funding shortfalls, but will hurt consumers. I apologize for the use of the word. The intent was that in the first couple years of the state's experiments, some states have massively overcharged electric vehicles far beyond what they would have paid. I would urge people, if you have a chance, to try to Google the words environmentalists advocate for electric vehicle fee. You won't find very many of those articles. I have attempted to show up here today very proactively, recognizing the charge of the commission. In my consultation with experts at the national and local level, the flags they gave me were significant concerns about the possibility of, in a budget crisis, electric vehicle fees being used to close the budget gap, but the risk of having them go farther than they should. So if the language I propose doesn't work, I would invite us to in some way capture the fact that we got presentations telling us that a large number of states overcharged, and to give proper guidance to signal that given our significant goals trying to expand electric vehicles, that we take that into account. That was information we heard, and we are urging the General Assembly to make sure to not repeat that mistake.
Thank you.
If anybody has any additional suggestions or amendments, I would welcome them. Would appreciate them, and otherwise I will strike. I would move to strike the non-punitive and second section.
The amendment that's on the floor is what is currently being debated, Commissioner. So we have not concluded that.
Understood.
So we're not amending that.
Understood.
Commissioner Feldmark, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for a second bite at the apple. As I listen to comments, I do want to thank Commissioner Tolkien for proposing this, because I think the intent is very important, that this, this is about EVs paying a fair share, not EVs being the solution to the Transportation Trust Fund's budget woes, right? And so I do think that's important, and I believe there's consensus on that. I also appreciate the concerns about how specific this recommendation is getting and sort of lack of clarity in the wording. I was going to suggest, and I'm realizing now that perhaps in the debate of the amendment is not the place, but if there's concern about including this in the recommendation, is there something we can include in the narrative speaking to the general intent of what's trying to be done here, so that we're not being creating more problems within the language of the recommendation, but just capturing that intent of fair share.
Yep.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go back and work that through with the staff. So thank you. I appreciate that.
So, Mr. Chair, you have a motion on the floor and a second on Commissioner Tolkien's amendment. So I think it's appropriate, if Commissioner Tolkien is still pressing his amendment, it would be for a vote.
Parliamentary procedure. Would it be appropriate for me to withdraw my amendment and introduce a new verbal amendment in a more limited fashion?
Yes, but I mean, we don't have alternative amendments in front of us currently.
I think this one would be fairly easy for folks to digest. I just want to suggest that we strike this, but we do make the change to the plug-in hybrid language, which everyone seems to support. I yield to you on any procedural way to achieve that.
Yeah, so you would have to withdraw technically what you put forward. And I believe the chair has an alternative to recommendation 1, which he has agreed to accept the plug-in language. And so I can walk through that orally if you withdraw the amendment you are pushing right now.
I withdraw my amendment.
Great.
Thank you.
So what the chair is going to put forward for recommendation 1 is, if you go to recommendation 1 on page 3, change the word offset instead to account for. All the references to hybrid vehicles will include plug-in vehicles. We will remove the last sentence. The commission believes that the state should use the increased funding for certain purposes. And then add Commissioner Chang's language after drivers saying, so increasing registration fee for all drivers, acknowledging current commitments of registration fees outside of transportation. Shock trauma uses registration fees and acknowledging that increasing would not, it's not intended to harm that funding. So if, Mr. Chair, if you're putting that on the table,
Okay.
I think you would look for a second.
Do I have a second? Any discussion? Hearing none.
Commissioner
Oh,
Hershey?
I'm sorry. Sorry.
Again, please. The addition.
So it'd be, these options include adding a new registration fee for electric and or plug-in hybrid vehicles or increasing registration fee for all drivers, acknowledging current commitments of registration fees outside of transportation. As Commissioner Chang talked about earlier in this meeting, registration fees are used for shock trauma. And so this is to acknowledge that this is not to, if that is the way the General Assembly wants to move, that this is not to take away funding for that critical purpose.
Understood. I guess my only concern is that I would specify that it's for shock trauma so that it's not.
Yeah, it's broader than shock trauma.
Broader.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, who is expert in funding right next to me. It goes to a lot of things. MEMSOF, thank you again. That's outside mine. So
Police thing too.
I guess we could say to including MEMSOF, yeah, MEMSOF funds.
What's the aviation?
Yeah, so
just reference the current fee structure in the statute because it, there are various components of registration. There's Chesapeake Bay and ag, and I don't want to get into the weeds.
Yeah,
but just
that's
just
also
acknowledge the
great
existing.
point. Outside my area. So yes,
Yeah, we'll make sure that we
it's
have the
clear.
catch-all.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hershey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the last sentence not being in there, but I still can't support this when it says increasing registration fees for all drivers. I feel if MDOT's budget and expenditure problems were solely related to the maintenance and construction of roads and bridges, then it may be fair to increase registration fees to pay for that. But MDOT's concerns that we heard are much broader than just roads and bridges. And I think this is opening the door, and I really don't think we discussed this in depth amongst this commission, but this again is putting more on the backs of motorists to fund the Transportation Trust Fund. As we've seen from the first page already, motorists are already contributing 53% of the revenue into the Transportation Trust Funds. When you talk about the gas tax, titling, and registration fees, it's almost 53% according to those numbers. So this would just increase further dependency on motorists to pay for the broader needs of MDOT through the Transportation Trust Funds. And frankly, I don't think that this commission has, dove deep enough into what the broader concerns are with respect to revenue and expenditure. So I can't support us just all of a sudden making a blanket statement that we're going to potentially raise registration fees for motorists just to pay into all of MDOT's modals.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a second. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Senator Hershey.
Yeah, just for the record, Senator Hershey, anybody else? Great, thank you.
Okay.
Are you good? This is great. Harry and Patrick, did you have the? I have them. We're gonna have staff pass out an alternative to recommendation 3.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So obviously there's been a lot of discussion about recommendation 3. I was comfortable with the recommendation as it came in, but obviously there's a lot of concern about it. And I have not as much direct experience crossing the Bay Bridge as Senator Hershey, but have worked over the years, much to Senator Hershey's chagrin, on legislation related to tolling and using toll revenue for other purposes. So in the spirit of the compromise and what many of the concerns that were raised, a proposed compromise change is being passed around that addresses some of the concerns from folks further down the horseshoe than Senator Hershey on tolls. So it would read, the commission recommends that the Maryland General Assembly consider requiring MDTA to adjust toll rates, including on out-of-state easy passes, to maximize toll revenues to generate new revenue to support projects in Maryland's broader transportation system outside of MDTA. The big difference here is that it would basically say, General Assembly, you should also consider broader toll changes besides just on out-of-state easy passes. Clearly, those who are opposed to any tolling will not be happy with this compromise, but I did hear a lot of feedback sitting up here from people who were interested in a broader tolling discussion. Personally, I've been interested in that discussion for a number of years. Many aren't. This just sort of opens up the possibility for further General Assembly consideration in the future. So that's the purpose of the amendment.
Any discussion? Commissioner Beidle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My only concern is how the bondholders for the Maryland Transportation Authority will weigh in on using the toll revenues for projects outside of the MDTA facilities. And I don't know who makes that decision or when we make that decision, but I do think it's an issue with the bondholders.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Hershey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with my chairman as well, too. I think that this, again, according to the Attorney General's office, could trigger a requirement that MDA make new disclosures to bondholders, which again, who knows what can happen as a result of that. Credit ratings could go down, rates could go up. You know, we run the risk of a number of different concerns to those that hold our trust agreements. Second, this, you know, again, this recommendation potentially has two unconstitutional components to it. The discriminatory toll design is potentially, again, against the Commerce Clause, the diversion of toll revenue against the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine. So one, we don't even know if these recommendations would be even constitutional or allowed. Second, you know, I don't know what the new number is right now, but as of 2021, out-of-state drivers owed more than $167 million to Maryland because they don't pay their tolls. If we focus this specifically on Easy Pass users, the way around it is certainly to just, if you're an out-of-state driver, you take the Easy Pass off your window and you go through the tolls. And, you know, we have no way to collect tolls from out-of-state drivers anyway. So I don't even know that works. And finally, with respect to broaden this out and just saying, hey, should we, you know, increase tolls so that can pay for all of our transportation woes? You know, I'd keep in mind that we keep hearing about foregone revenue from the Hogan administration toll cuts. You know, when SHA came or MDTA came and talked to us, they did not express budgetary concerns until 28-29 fiscal year. Okay, so they did not express concerns that the toll cuts hurt MDTA. So again, we're now looking at this as solely a means of revenue paid for by the 9 tolling facilities to fund all of or a major portion of the MDOT modals. Again, I think that's highly discriminatory that only those that go through tolls now have to pick up an additional burden to do this. And secondly, you know, again, we haven't found out that MDTA needs this additional revenue. So, you know, for that, I think this amendment is actually, you know, as my colleague said, much worse. He didn't say it that way, but he knew that I was going to say that it's much worse because we've broadened it out to say that we think that increasing tolls can solve our problems. And I don't think that has been the discussion. Again, there have been comments here. I don't think that's been the discussion of this commission to broadly say that we should increase tolls to do that. Again, I also think that this opens up broader concerns that tolls could be located in a number of different places across the state. If we're looking at tolling as a way to fund the Transportation Trust Fund, which it currently does not, then why couldn't tolls go everywhere within the state? Other than
I
federal
don't-
highways, yes, you have to get approval for
Right.
that, just like we will if we pass this. If the General Assembly were to pass something that is unconstitutional, what the state highway would not allow, or the federal government would not allow. But go
Well,
ahead.
I have a very different recollection of the presentation that the modal administrators made to this commission about the state of the tolls within MDTA. And I believe very, specifically that there was an expressed interest by the executive director at the time relative to that. And there were specific references to what happened to the authority relative to the toll collections in the prior administration. So I will have to respectfully disagree with you, Senator, that in fact that was, a presentation that this commission did have around tolls and the need for additional tolls at the authority. Someone can correct me if I have that wrong, but I believe that that is the case. I'm not going to do the job of the secretary or the of the chair of the authority here, but that is my very,
I'm sure we could go back and find that out and see when MDTA feels that they would need to increase tolls to more specifically fund just MDTA.
They spoke to the detriment to the authority relative to the toll reduction that was enacted by the prior administration. So I would suggest that the damage was done at the time that happened.
And I'm sure that many of us would like to see what that damage was and actually see.
I believe that they have reported that to us in terms of a $500 million loss to the authority relative to that. Steve or other people can correct me if I have that wrong.
Mr. Chairman, just a loss to the authority doesn't mean that they were not able to operate as though they were required to. It does not mean that they were not able to meet their debt obligations. Does not mean that they weren't able to do the maintenance and upgrades that they were required to do. It just means that maybe $500 million wasn't necessary for their operations.
Or it actually didn't provide them with the ability to move on projects that they otherwise might have worked on. That's a possibility.
And that, again, that is always a decision that any authority would make, but we do have a brand new bridge in Southern Maryland that they move forward with.
I'm not going to take the bait on that one, but thank you.
So anyways, I just going back, I feel that this amendment is broadens the scope. I think that there's two opportunities that this is highly unconstitutional. And I also don't believe that just because we have the mechanism to tax motorists even more, that we should increase that. While again, as we've talked about fairness, bringing EVs back into this, that everybody should pay their fair share, but to have all the other motorists that are driving around the state not have to put that same contribution into the Transportation Trust Fund, just as motorists that go through tolls, just because we have a mechanism to collect money from them.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Commissioner Laria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As one of the seconders of this, I just want to say briefly, if we can't make a detailed recommendation on tolling, like you should raise tolls this much, or a tier below that, you should raise tolls, then, and I'll say as an aside, it's, I haven't done the math, and maybe that's why we can't make the recommendation right now, but I believe that reducing tolls that have created a $500 million loss of revenue for the state was irresponsible, and we should fix it. I don't know if the number is 500 million or 250 million, or if it's $1 billion. It's some number, okay, and we'll get to it. But if we can't make those detailed recommendations now, for God's sake, this is the least we could do. It simply says consider requiring MDTA to adjust rates, including what we're doing here, returning to my earlier point, at the very least, we're putting this issue in play, in the 2024 session. We're discharging our responsibility. I hope we will do more on it during the interim, but at the very least, I think this resolution, this revised recommendation is the least we could do.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly support that. Are there any others? Oh, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder, this says a little different than Mr. Laria just stated. It says it recommends that the Maryland General Assembly require MDT to adjust toll rates.
Are you
No,
looking
oh,
on
you're
the,
looking at the amendment. I was
at the
looking-
amendment?
I'm sorry. I was looking at the original language.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ackerman.
Just a point,
Sure.
on this one, whether or not you raise tolls or the old tolls, I think that's a different discussion. I think the rub for me on this one was that you're pulling it out of the roads that were tolled. I've always viewed tolls as an enterprise fund, that the investments that are made, the tolls should go back into the enterprise fund. I believe that's the selling point for my community when they were talking about it up in our way. And I think I could appreciate why we're trying to do it to some of the needs, but I just would say I'm not opposed to the tolling issue because everything should be on the table to balance the butt. It's just that you're pulling tolls out of the roads that are being tolled and putting into the general system. And I'd be concerned about just starting that precedent, and then as well as the decision making that goes into then where does that money go, and is that going to leave those roles done? So appreciate what you're trying to do here, but I can't support this.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments? So I have a motion to approve the amendment as introduced by Commissioner Corman. Those in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senator Hershey, Commissioner Ali, Commissioner Ackerman, Kirchhoff, sorry, Jim, Payne, and Kutch. Okay.
Instead, is that Commissioner
No, it's
Mon?
next.
Sorry.
Yep.
It's hard to see down there. Thank you.
Okay,
That recommendation passes.
great.
At this point, Mr. Chair, if there are any additional recommendations anyone would like to put forward, I think this would be the appropriate time.
Okay. Commissioner Thompson?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a recommendation that the train recommend to the General Assembly of Maryland to place before the Maryland voters a Transportation, Infrastructure, and Environmental Bond Act to fund much needed improvements to Maryland's local and state roads and bridges, transportation facilities and vehicles, sewers, drinking water infrastructure, and to support efforts to reduce pollution and combat climate change. That is my proposal.
Is there a second? There's no second. Commissioner Tolkien, second. Okay. Any discussion? I mean, this is a topic that, I'm happy to have, staff have more discussion in the 2024 work product. We have not debated this and discussed it, so I would be very uncomfortable voting on it in this current arrangement. So I would ask that people reject this and we will take it into study consideration for the interim, if that's acceptable, Commissioner.
The reason why I think it's important is, number one, next year is a perfect year for the legislature to consider putting this on the ballot. These environmental and transportation bond acts often get very much popular support. The second thing is that I think it sends a signal to the transportation and infrastructure and environmental community that are very concerned about the proposed cuts that are going to be recommended. And I think that it's only a recommendation, but it's a strong market signal that we need to continue to invest. But the voters will ultimately decide. So that's I don't see the harm in making a recommendation on something that I think that is going to be very popular with the public, especially.
I appreciate that, but again, we've had lots of discussion this afternoon in terms of specific recommendations and broader findings. I would certainly like the opportunity to have more discussion on this before we're going to, put this in as a finding or recommendation from the commission at this point. Is that agreeable to you, Commissioner, to move that into a work product?
I pause on that, see if anyone else has any thoughts on it, because I just really troubled by it.
Okay, is there anyone else that would like to discuss this point? Okay. 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 Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that. Anything, any other items, recommendations that we have? Okay, that's it. Well, all right. Well, that was a fun little afternoon. I want to thank everybody for this conversation, both spirited and informative. And I really do appreciate, you know, the expressed thoughts that came forward in this. Commissioner Tolkien, are you?
Right.
That's okay.
You had said that we were going to have a conversation, and I thought you also said that we were going to have a conversation about plans for later on. Were you closing the whole
yes.
meeting or just the first part of it?
I was trying to recollect myself.
Great.
Thank
you.
Discussions that we've had, if that's okay. Yeah. But you know, I will not dismiss you just yet, because yes, I think Steve has or Michelle, Steve and Michelle are going to give us the lay of the land for the 2024 session. I will preemptively say that I do not expect during the 90-day session that we will be convening, unless someone higher up the chain tells me that we are meeting. So I just say that in advance of them, discussing the work plan for 2024. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going, and on your desk, there is the matrix of things that we believe we discussed this interim, and things that we need to cover next interim. So I will flag those. I would also acknowledge that the report of this commission is due January 1st. And so in effort to save time, if anyone is interested in emailing what they would like to be included in the appendices of next year's items, because this doesn't need a vote, we're more than welcome to say commissioners were interested in the following items for next year. So do not feel like you need to say it right now. We will take that into consideration when we email you. So the things left on our agenda are the current state funding sources and structure of the Maryland Transportation Trust Fund, including trends in the general fund and general obligation support for state transportation expenditures, and analysis of whether this approach to support should continue or transportation expenditures should solely be from the trust fund. Short and long-term construction and maintenance funding needs for transit, highway, pedestrian, bicycle, heavy rail, shipping, air travel, and other transportation needs. Options for public-private partnerships, including partnerships with local governments to meet transportation funding needs, including funding options. Discussion was started on changes in transportation technology and trends that will impact transportation infrastructure needs and cost to the state. So we believe that will continue next interim. The structure of regional transportation authorities and the ability of these authorities to meet transportation needs in various regions of the state. Discussion was started on options for sustainable long-term revenue sources for transportation, but that will continue. And then options for improving Maryland Department of Transportation's ability and capacity to deliver major capital projects. So we will be doing all of those next interim. It will be a long, exciting interim. If you have specifics that you believe should be covered in these topics, as in presentations, that is what we are looking for now, or in recognition of all your time, feel free to email them to us staff. We will solicit that to you to get that in the appendices as well. So with that, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you. In 2024, I look forward to the commission reviewing items that can raise hundreds of millions of dollars in new funding, beyond some of the limitations of these incremental changes that we are recommending today. Two ways that I believe we should look about doing that. One would be through an expansion of the state's speed camera program. And the second would be through a statewide tolling study. So for the statewide tolling study, I would refer you to Michigan's statewide tolling study, which was done at the request of the Michigan legislature, and would propose a very low per mile rate across a wide array of different roads, keeping in mind all sorts of federal regulations as well as state and local regulations there. And then as it relates to speed camera usage, we do have some jurisdictions that utilize speed cameras and do so very well, particularly in school zones. We have some data on the amount of money that each of those is able to raise and on the complexities that are introduced by speed cameras. So I think that's something that we should definitely study as a long-term funding solution for the Transportation Trust Fund. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Winstead.
To you earlier, but the recent meeting of the ASHTO, American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, had an opportunity to talk to the new executive director of the Transportation Research Board. Neil Peterson, our former state highway administrator, was out retiring head of it. But they're looking at this whole question of technology and what states are doing to implement other approaches to tapping VMT solutions. And so I've recommended to the chair, she's willing to bring a group from TRB to the commission meeting. I think it'd be very worthwhile because they're basically got devoted staff that's supposed to be looking at all good ideas in the state and bringing technology leaders that are proposing various technology solutions. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. Anytime we can spend with Neil, I'm happy to do.
Yeah.
Exactly. Commissioner Tolkien.
Thank you. I wanted to urge that in 2024, a representative from the Maryland Department of the Environment would join this either as an official through legislation or an ad hoc member. I believe as we're getting into other spending, having a representative from MDE here to discuss alignment with the state's goals would be very, very helpful.
Okay. Okay. Appreciate that. Anyone else? Oh, Commissioner Sakata.
Yeah, I think, obviously the usage or how we integrate road user charge VMTs to the Easy Pass tolling would be definitely helpful as we kind of look forward to the future, next 100 years. And I know Commissioner Nick, we part of the work zone, governor's work zone group, as a secretary, a few others were involved, and I know we look to kind of recoup some of those costs. I know it's the lowest penalty in the country for speeding through a work zone. I know there was an accident just today on District 3, so we kind of are saddened by that and looking to combat that from a driver behavior standpoint. Chrissy Nizer and Terry Seuss was helpful on that. So we look forward to their recommendations as they put forth. And so thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Banks.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we I'm looking forward to the ability to propose new opportunities for revenue streams. I think we would also urge the commission to look at opportunities directly outside of the transit space that can be funneled into transit projects, things like real estate, cannabis, and and other types of taxes and fees that could promote ridership. Obviously appreciated the opportunity to look at opportunities to raise revenue today, but it obviously strikes me how we're just kind of scratching the surface on ways to close really significant funding gaps. So we encourage discussions around new revenue raising opportunities and also in ways that are equitable, that don't have a disproportionate impact on workers and people of color. So I know we're excited to have that conversation. Look forward to sending recommendations.
Great. Thank you very much. Commissioner Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just on item number 9, options for improving MDOT's ability and capacity to deliver a major capital project. I think as part of that, it would be great to understand, I think, how MDOT really delivers capital projects currently. And what I mean by that is also the contract procurement process for hiring contractors that are going to do design work and then actually putting the improvements into the ground, and ensuring that that is perhaps done in a way that maximizes the amount of funding that actually goes into the infrastructure. Because I'm not sure that is always the case. So I think that would be something that I would like us to understand and look at.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Well, again, I would be remiss if I did not thank all of our staff here who have labored endlessly on this and tried to keep me on track as much as possible. I appreciate that. From the AV and administrative staff who have helped with the commission and putting these meetings in person, particularly Jewel Harris and Anna Belch. I also want to thank the MDOT staff, Jacqueline Hartman, who I hope is feeling better soon. Tony Bridges is in the room. Thank you, Tony, and the rest of the MDOT leadership, both from the modal side and from the Secretary's office, have been hugely helpful. Could not have done a lot of this without the tremendous support from the DLS staff, both Michelle Lambert, our colleague here, Steve McCullough and Carrie Cook. Thank you all tremendously for the efforts that's been put in. Lots of hours have been dedicated to this work, and I really do appreciate it very much. So thank you for that. Lastly, I want to thank all of you. I'm really proud of this commission and the members that represent all the areas of the states and all levels of the state and local government, members from the private and nonprofit sectors. You all are incredibly busy and important people, and you have made time to come to these meetings in person and engage in these topics. And I can't thank you enough. And I certainly hope that, given what 2023 has dealt out to us, that you all will have a safe, happy, and prosperous holiday season. I'm very much looking forward to spending time with my family and friends, and I look forward to seeing folks in 2024. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. And with that,